I saw the movie Sound of Freedom. Very important movie. Very disturbing movie about a disturbing reality. Child sex trafficking. Based on the testimony of Tim Ballard. It relates to the Jeffrey Epstein story. There's a part in the movie where there's an island and children are being brought to the island. It relates to the testimony of Corey Feldman, who speaks about pedophilia that he was exposed to when he was coming up in the movie industry, and how he and his friend Corey Haim were victims of that. There's a documentary that you could see on YouTube called An Open Secret that deals with that. I'll put links to some of these things down below. During my time where I was heavily interested in the son of Sam, the David Berkowitz story, the serial killer, and how he would later in prison become a born-again Christian. But he testified that he was involved with devil worship. Now there's a popular book called The Ultimate Evil that connects David Berkowitz with devil-worshipping cults and pedophiles and so on and so forth. And according to Manny Grossman, who I was watching a lot of his videos as well, Manny Grossman ultimately concluded, and he did a lot of research and interviewed people, and you could see his channel. He ultimately concluded that that David Berkowitz operated alone. But that's not to say that these pedophile networks and devil-worshipping groups don't exist. They clearly do exist. During one of his presentations, he interviewed a man named Mike Codella, who's a retired detective. And Mike Codella, and he has his own channel, and again, I'll put links to these things below. Mike Codella had interviewed a man named Tiny Latini, who was the head of a motorcycle gang called the Rat Pack. And he was somebody who would be hired, not him alone, but him and I guess other associates from that gang would be hired to do security at these wealthy parties that would go on in Westchester and Yonkers, in mansions, I guess, and estates where, according to him, devil worship was going on, pagan practices, and child sacrifice and pedophilia. And he himself got into that and was arrested for that. So he was somebody that Mike Codella had interviewed. And so there is a connection between all of these things involving the terrorizing and the persecuting and abuse of children with spiritualism, a spiritualistic connection. Not long ago, I was speaking to a woman from a church, not a church that I pastor, but she was telling me that her father was a wealthy devil worshiper and of the abuses of her father, and that it's all revolving around sex and sexual perversion, and how she had walked in a room, I guess in their mansion or in their house or somewhere, where he was about to perform some sort of ritual on a young underage girl. And so there's a connection. There are evil things going on in this world, and it relates to what the Bible tells us. This is something that has been going on for a very long time in human history. According to the book, I'll turn to the book of Leviticus, Leviticus chapter 20. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse number 2. I'm reading here from the New King James, and it says, "Again, you shall say to the children of Israel, whoever of the children of Israel or of the strangers who dwell in Israel, who give any of his descendants, any of his seed, to Molech, he shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. And according to the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary on this verse, it says here, this was not merely a dedication of the children to Molech, but was an actual sacrifice of the children as a burnt offering. So we're talking about the sacrifice of children. The devil has his eye on the children. The devil has his eye on the children, and he's had his eye on the children for a long time because they are the most innocent among us. When we look in the book of Leviticus chapter 18 gets very explicit, and it's dealing with the context of pagan worship and pagan practices. Let's take a look there in Leviticus chapter 18, and let's go to verse number 22. And it says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." So this is dealing with homosexuality. And then it says, "You shall not mate with any animal to defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is perversion." So the Bible is not mixing words, getting very specific on the perversions taking place. And then it says, "Do not defile yourself with any of these things, for by all these, the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you." So the pagan nations, this was part of the pagan practices. These were the things that they were doing. Paganism involved perversion, and paganism in today's world and spiritualism in today's world involves perversion. And so these pagan nations that God would bring judgment upon, they were practicing these things. These were the nations of the Hittites and the Girgasites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. According to the book of Deuteronomy 7 and verse 1, it says, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And it was the Lord that would cast them out, as it says right in the beginning of the verse, Deuteronomy 7:1. "When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess and has cast out many nations before you." So these are the nations that were spoken about there in Leviticus 18 from 22 to 24. So it wasn't just Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. Of course, they were pagans there and doing all of that perversion as well. But these nations, this was something that would repeatedly happen, as Romans chapter 1 tells us. When you go to Romans chapter 1 and starting in around verse number 20 and continuing onward there, dealing with the worship of the creature over the creator. And then we get into the homosexuality being tied with that, according to Romans chapter 1 and verse 26 and 27. So this is something that happened over and over again. Again, there were perverted persons in the house of the Lord or connected with the house of the Lord, according to 2 Kings 23:7. So when Jerusalem had compromised, when Israel had compromised with these pagan nations, they also started to bring in perversion and abomination as well. We read about the abominations in Ezekiel chapter 8, and then we see perverted persons in the house of the Lord. Josiah's reform would involve getting rid of them, but perversion, spiritualism connects to perversion. Spiritualism connects to perversion. And the perversions that are being dealt with in the movie An Open or rather the movie, The Sound of Freedom. Those perversions are perversions that are characterizing the end times and are related to spiritualism and spiritualistic practices. I'm going to read something over here in the book Patriarchs and Prophets. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 688. Page 688. And here we read, Patriarchs and Prophets, Ellen White, 688. It says, the teaching of the demon gods in ancient times fostered the vilest license. The divine precepts condemning sin and enforcing righteousness were set aside. Truth was lightly regarded, and impurity was not only permitted, but enjoined. Then she goes on to say something very important here. Well, that was important, what I just read, but let's continue. Spiritualism declares that there is no death, no sin. You see that? No judgment. Doesn't that sound like the world we live in today? No judgment, no retribution. This is what spiritualism declares, she's saying. No retribution, that men are unfallen demigods, that desire is the highest law. Do what thou wilt. Spiritualism, devil worship. Desire is the highest law, and that man is accountable only to himself. The barriers that God has erected to guard truth, purity, and reverence are broken down, and many are thus emboldened to sin. Look at the world that we live in, the glorification of homosexuality and transgenderism, and now pedophilia is coming. And I believe there are going to be attempts to normalize it if they're not already happening, which I think they are. I've heard one argument say, well, they're born that way. Well, that's a similar argument that's made in defense of homosexuality. And we continue here. Does not such teaching suggest an origin similar to that of demon worship? And so she's saying these things of spiritualism, connecting spiritualism to pagan practices of the past. And according to the Great Controversy, page 588, spiritualism is going to play a major role in the end time deception. A major role in the end time deception, lawlessness. Because the doctrines of God, the biblical doctrines, are a guard against spiritual confusion. But spiritualism attacks the doctrines of God and creates confusion and wickedness. You know, we live in a time where if you act and you play a role in a movie, Hollywood will give you an Academy Award, especially if you play the role of a homosexual. But a movie like The Sound of Freedom, don't expect that to get any recognition at all from the Hollywood establishment. These are the times that we are living in.